Hey, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this week's edition of Getting In, a college coach conversation. It's a new year, and I seem to have forgotten the name of the show. Okay. Welcome to the show. Happy New Year for everyone who's here with us today. As you can see, if you're watching this video on one of our social media channels, I'm joined today by two guests this morning. I've got to my left, as I'm looking at the screen, we have Kristine Sawicki. Hey, Kristine, how you doing?
Hi, Ian.
And we have Becky Leichtling down beneath me, but not beneath me, below me in terms of like where we are on the screen. Hi, Becky.
Hey, happy to be here, Ian.
I'm glad to have you. So we, a couple of weeks on the show, we did our New Year's resolutions and talked a little bit about what students and families can be thinking about as they're heading into the new year. And what I wanted to do for today, and invited you both on to discuss with me, is to talk a little bit about our prior year's reflections. What did we observe when we were working with all of the students who we worked with over the course of the last year? And especially what made students more and less successful with respect to the process? Now, a little bit of just framing. I really like to measure whether the college application process was successful or not before I start to get decisions back from colleges, because I think that you can assess how you feel about that process in a way that helps you to measure whether the outcome was worthwhile or not. And so that's why we're talking about it here in January instead of in April, when all the decisions come back and we could say, oh, this kid got in there, they were successful, right? There, we want to talk more about process. So we work with hundreds of students every year. We work directly with small handfuls of students with our own caseloads. And so I wanted to talk in our first segment here about just what we saw from among seniors who are applying to college this year, especially given the pandemic and the effects of the pandemic. And then in our second segment, talk about some of the traits that we observed that were sort of markers for success from parents, from students, and think about how rising juniors can incorporate that into their process for next year. Does that all make sense? Is that okay with you too?
Yeah, that sounds great. And I love the framework that you've set, particularly the word process and evaluating the process. I think the word outcome is often attached and associated with the application calendar, but it really is a process. And when I start reflecting on the families that I've talked with and the students that I've supported, it very much feels like a process. So I appreciate that word and your reflection of defining success with that process before the decisions come. So thank you for that.
Okay, good. Becky, are you cool with that too? Are you all right with the ground rules?
I think that sounds great. And it's interesting I also love the word process, and I immediately thought of a plan, which I think is both important, but also part of the process is having a plan that is flexible and can change and evolve. And so to me, it circles back to process. I love that. And I appreciate your setting those ground rules.
Awesome. That's great. What do we notice about students this year? This is a really funky year, right? Like everybody knows about the pandemic. For the students who are seniors this year, their junior year or sophomore year. Their sophomore year was ended early. Most of their junior year was taught remotely and online. They maybe got back to school in the mid-spring of their junior year and then back to school potentially fully in person in the fall of this senior year. How did that affect the way that students were interacting with the college application process? Were there any things that you noted that were particularly different about student engagement with essay writing or with planning or anything at all? It's a fairly open question. Kristine, why don't you start?
Yeah, I think there was some, very new procedural elements to this year. There was a lot of conversation around test optional. How does my extracurricular profile look and how will it be evaluated given disruption? The Common Application had a specific COVID-19 question and its impact on you. That needed to be written. So there were definitely new conversations, I guess not new compared to last year, but certainly relevant to this year's class. Kind of qualitatively working with students this year, I guess if I were to put two adjectives that seemed a little bit more prominent in this year's class. One was independence. I felt like a lot of my students wanted to do things more their way. And I was more in a support role with a lot of them. And two, I noticed a lot more kind of last minute college add-ons. I think there was just a little bit more anxiousness that stemmed from the uncertainty that perhaps the last 2 years has set a foundation for.
I want to come back to that independence piece because I think that's really interesting. I want to unpack that a little bit more. But first I want to talk about the anxiousness, because this is a process that obviously creates anxiety for families. It always has. It will continue to do so. A pandemic can exacerbate that. Did you think that things were more strongly felt in terms of that sense of anxiety and uncertainty this year than in prior, more quote normal years, or was it about the same as you typically would have seen?
I say I think it felt more present to me this year in the families that I worked with. There was seemingly just kind of less trust in the overall list and the process as a whole. And so there was just a greater instinct. I had a lot more conversations about a slightly bigger list, and sometimes even more than slightly bigger, a bigger list, and quite a few calls with last minute additions of colleges. We're just trying to squeak this last one in. I might as well toss this in just to have another option. Increased.
Becky, did you see that same kind of more pronounced difference in terms of people's stress levels this year, or was it pretty consistent with prior years for you?
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think in addition to what Kristine said, I think there were a higher number of students that I perceived beginning with, for lack of a better term, a deficit mindset. I'm missing something because junior year was, I'm missing this. I don't have this.
Yeah.
And there's always students who feel like, oh, they're friends in NHS and they're missing that. But so many more students had a different experience than older siblings or friends who in previous grades. That was where we started their conversation. And so it took a while to reframe, no, you are a full human. You have lived a rich life. Let's figure out what there is to share there. And I also think it's no surprise to anyone that mental health challenges through COVID have been significantly affecting families in ways we have never imagined before. And so conversations about college were also rooted in a place of very different starting points for a lot of folks. So that changes how we counsel and changes what students are thinking about for next steps and changes how this fits into their life. And that was all pretty different as well.
Yeah, the application just had more things, I think, this year because of, as you mentioned, Kristine, the COVID essay and differences in terms of test optional, which I think created more questions and more concern. But I want to come back to that sense of independence and also the sense of isolation that you touched on, Becky, right? Which is, in past years, you're at school every single day. You see what your peers are up to. And for 18 months, students were essentially on their own. I mean, they would have had friends that they were connecting with, but a lot of the schoolwork they were doing, even showing up for class, was done on their own, independently, which I think puts up those walls. There's not as much of a sense of trust of, well, I haven't been able to do these things. Are other people doing these things? Because they don't discuss it with their friends at school. They don't get to see what other people are up to. There's not an opportunity to engage with what is normal in this context. And so I had a lot of conversations with students of saying, I know that you weren't able to do your fall sport. Nobody was, right? But I think students don't necessarily understand that because they don't see it in the same kind of way that they would have previously on a high school campus. But Kristine, you said that sort of was realized in the way that students engaged more independently, more of a go at their own way kind of approach to the process. Do you have any examples of that, or can you help our listeners better understand kind of what you mean by it?
Yeah, I think quite a bit more than a typical year. Students were wanting to share their essay work with me in a more careful, on their own pace way, as opposed to being open to, I guess, a more strict schedule of churning through the number of essays that needed to be done. I helped my students set up a schedule, and they flexed with that schedule with confidence that they had a system to navigate that was different. And a lot of students had increased confidence of, oh, I don't need you to look at this essay or provide feedback or brainstorm with me on this. I think I've got this one. It's just similar to this one. And there was just increased confidence in, I know how to do this.
I want to press on that though. I wonder whether you think that was an increased sense of confidence. And Becky, I don't know if you've had this experience as well, but it felt to me a little bit this year that students were more reluctant to share openly what their work was. And sometimes for me, that was my students presenting as being confident, like I've got this, but I think I could feel more that it was, I don't really want to share this with you. I'm not sure it's right. I'm not proud of it yet. It's not where I want it to be. And so there was less of a willingness, I think, to be vulnerable in terms of sharing a really unpolished first draft. And that led to procrastination.
I like the positive lens of building, of increased independence. I also think this is probably super individual, and different students were responding to being remote for a year. I think the other way of, some students I worked with, I think, had not had the research paper for English that would have, forced them to do that analytical writing and the regular check-ins with reflective pieces for their, and so it felt like for some students were more independent. I got this. I've been learning independently for a year. And some students felt like, sorry, I haven't done that sort of work before. It wasn't what we were doing, and were even less confident in the sort of exchange of ideas and writing that is common for this stage in the process. So I think it was different, and I think the difference was pretty broad and varied in how it landed for different kids based on their personality and their school setting.
Were there any kind of trends that we saw, or is it just kind of like, I might have had a handful more that were more independent this year, but maybe next year that flips back in a different direction? Is there anything that you could definitively say about, this kind of second year of the pandemic in terms of the effects on students? I'm putting you on the spot.
One thing that I always appreciate when working with a writer is I think that students who are also readers usually do have an easier time adjusting to the sort of writing we're doing. And so whether you were remote or not, I think the students who throughout the pandemic were also still just reading, that just felt like a huge leap for kids to come back to the writing process.
Yeah, I think that's right. If you were not reading in between your classes, if you went to more of those video games or Netflix or whatever as a decompress, as opposed to reading, some people decompress by reading. I think that made the writing process much more challenging when it queued up here in the fall. I also felt like for me, a lot of students got started a lot later than I would have liked, or I think they would have historically. There was a lot more procrastination than you would typically see with teenagers this year than I have historically. And we saw that in a few different contexts. Kristine,
some of that is,
go ahead. No, please.
Colleges were closed for a year. And so students weren't visiting their state university. They weren't engaged, reps weren't coming to their high school. And so I think conversations about college, I'm trying to think back to how we were all, how life felt in summer of 2020 and fall of 2021, like families weren't talking about your college tour in the same way. And so that was delayed for understandable reasons.
And things were very compressed in that respect. The whole search process was really, really compressed. That's for sure.
And like Kristine said, extended to the very last minute with list building. That's
right. Kristine, anything that you observed that you could say definitively was a trend through this year, or is it kind of like, well, it might have been this kid or that kid, but who knows?
Yeah, a little bit more the latter. I mean, I think, with, having done this work for, 2 decades, there tends to be, kind of waves of, this class feels this or has this more prominent characteristic. And I think it's really hard to figure out the causality of how much was pandemic, how much of it, happens to be overall. And this is such an individualized process, how every student impacts and everything that's going around them. And those are a multitude of factors. So I guess if anything, I would point to it is those administrative things that I pointed out at the beginning. There's this extra layer of conversation that goes around the process that I can say with confidence is a causality of the pandemic. Other things I think are interesting trends to note, and hopefully we don't have too long of a data collection period here with the pandemic, but right. Maybe we can synthesize things with a little bit more time.
We hope it's just a blip for sure. Yeah. We are going to take a break. And when we come back, we'll have Kristine and Becky with us to talk a little bit about students that did this process really well and what they did to take control of the process, to put themselves in a strong position to be successful with managing tasks and their parents and timelines and all of those other things. So stick around if you want to hear about what you might do in the coming year in order to be successful with the process.